Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining me today. I am so excited to dive into a conversation on this topic of grace. I can't tell you exactly which day it was on the calendar, but I will never forget when the email came from Deseret Book and the original Grace book popped up. And I think it was maybe the same day I was at the store buying it because I just knew that my heart needed to know what you had to say about grace. So I'm excited to talk about the book today.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm glad you found the book helpful.
Absolutely. I devoured it. I've heard of lots of people that have not been able to devour it, but I couldn't put it down. And I've read it multiple times. So, if you were going to just sum up the book in a paragraph or two, what would be your response? Just a sweet, short, condensed, what is your book all about?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways we might try to summarize what the book is trying to say. One way to say it would be that grace is not God's backup plan, right? It's not plan B. It's not what you do when people fail to save themselves, but that grace was the plan all along, right? A divine partnership with God from beginning to end was the plan all along. Right? It's not just the path to salvation, it's the very substance of salvation to enjoy that kind of partnership with God. Another way to say it might be that grace is original, not sin, right? Grace comes first, then sin as a rejection on our part of God's grace. Or another way to say it might be that love or grace is a commandment, not a reward, right? And when we end up treating love as a kind of reward or grace as a kind of reward, then we fail to fulfill the law, which commands us to love always and everywhere and everyone.
Yeah. Ooh, I love all three of those. Very beautifully put. So as I read throughout the book, I see you mentioning a lot about your relationship with your father. You also talk a lot about the book, Believing Christ. And it seems like those two things were major guideposts in your journey to understanding grace. Were there other things? I mean, it's probably a lifetime discovery, right? How do you name them all? But what other things played into the crafting of this book? Like I say, it's probably a lifetime of work. But is there anything else in your mind that stands out as significant?
Yeah, this book is, for me, in my own mind at least, very clearly a distillation of about 20 years of pretty hard, careful work, if you can call what philosophers do for a living hard and careful work. On the one hand, it's the kind of product of my, I think, relatively serious efforts to try to understand and live the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? Just as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to try to put into practice what's actually at stake in living a new life in Christ. On the other hand, the book is also very much the product of my trying to sort out, as a scholar of religion and philosophy, what's at stake in how we talk about grace, right? So in some ways, this is the fourth or fifth book I've written about grace, depending on how we count. My doctoral dissertation was about grace. My first professional scholarly book was about grace. My third professional scholarly book was about grace. Those are books that no Mormon should ever worry about looking at or reading. But for me, that kind of scholarly philosophical work laid a lot of the pipe. I found I would need to try to rethink parts of what for me it meant to start a new life in Christ, in His grace.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some of that today. I know you said that if we all could just figure out the answer to how do we take this ethereal, non-physical idea of putting Jesus Christ on, like literally, I say that we clothe ourselves in Jesus Christ. And I've been saying that a lot lately. And I had a friend the other day that was like, what does that even mean? Like, what do you mean when you say that? But how do we take this ethereal idea? I know he's real, right? But he's not physically with us every day. And so how do we actually take him and put him on? I'm excited to dive in. So I have talked to quite a few people who have some people devoured your book, others have read a few chapters and been like, I don't know if I understand, like, and had to put it down for a time. So I know that in the first chapter, one of my questions, because oftentimes as I read through it too, I would think, okay, do I actually understand what he's trying to say here? Right? Like I need to put on my scholarly brain and see if I can understand. So from chapter 1, you're talking about suffering and maybe the purposes of suffering. Like that's kind of the theme of chapter 1. I'm curious, in there you mention the natural and material order of things versus the moral order of things. And I've read it lots of times and I'm still not 100% sure that I understand exactly what you're trying to say there. So I'd love to know how those two things apply to the discussion of suffering.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very philosophical question. I suspect you don't want an especially philosophical answer. So
Dumb it down for me.
I'll see what I can do. Part of the frame for the book is to contrast traditional Christian belief in original sin with what I think is a much more restoration-worthy belief in something like original grace. Right? We as Latter-day Saints don't believe in the doctrine of original sin. That part is clear. But in its stead, I think we have space to articulate the idea that grace is original, right? That grace is what comes first. That grace, as I said earlier, is plan A, not plan B. And that obedience to God and living in covenant with God is a way of living into that grace that he's already ready and willing to offer to us. The doctrine of original sin is traditionally rooted in the idea that if we suffer, it's because we deserve it, right? And that idea that suffering is always deserved in one way or another, it's always in some ways, it's in one way or another, it's the result of someone's fault, right? Somebody had done something wrong. That idea is rooted in also the traditional Christian idea that God created the world out of nothing, right? And because God created everything, he must have created everything perfectly, without any kind of suffering, is the assumption. And that if God created everything perfectly without any suffering, then if there is any suffering, it must be because somebody did something wrong, right? And thus the suffering is deserved. But it's not only the case that we as Latter-day Saints don't believe that in the doctrine of original sin, it's also the case that as Latter-day Saints, we don't believe that God created the world out of nothing. At least Joseph Smith clearly taught, right, that the world in some sense, reality has in some sense always existed, that you and I are in some sense co-eternal with God, and that while God creates by organizing the world, he doesn't create it out of nothing, right? So there's room, I think, in a Latter-day Saint way of thinking about the world for suffering to just be part of the fabric of reality, right? The fabric is just part of the material order, right? It's just part of the natural world as you and I know it. And the gospel then is a way of helping us to deal with that, right? It's a way of greeting the difficulties inherent in reality with grace in the same way that God does. And so we're free, I think, to see reality as an occasion for grace rather than seeing our suffering as an indication that we're bad or wrong or deserve to experience whatever pain we experience.
That's so beautiful. What if it's just part of the existence, right? Part of the experience, and stop putting so many labels on it, and just I can't remember exactly how she said it, but this woman talked about that when we're in our suffering, it's not about why is this happening to me, but who is this teaching me God is? Because he comes in with his grace, right? And teaches us so much about who he is and what he's capable of and how he wants to help us in the midst of our natural experiences.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the way I often talk about this in the book is in terms of the difference between trying to figure out what we do or don't deserve versus trying to figure out what is or isn't needed. Right? Grace never asks what people do or don't deserve, right? It doesn't ask that question why, with the assumption that people would or wouldn't deserve whatever they suffer. Grace is only ever concerned with the love that needs to be given now, right? In light of how things are and in light of what's needed to make them better. Love here as again, as a commandment, not a reward.
Yeah, I love that. It's that whole stop trying to earn your way to heaven, right?
Yeah,
Let's come together and learn.
That very attempt to earn our way into heaven is the essence of what it means to be a sinner, right? To think that I'm supposed to do it on my own and thus refuse my partnership with God and thus turn down his offer of grace and then wonder why, as a sinner, I find myself so broken and graceless. Right?
Why I'm suffering so much.
What's the problem? Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, I love that. I think one of the other things, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but you really just invited people in this book into an experiment in restoration thinking, right? And you didn't say, I'm right or I'm wrong. Let's just start a conversation. Let's just start maybe tweaking things, looking at things differently, and take what you like, leave what you don't, and just allow this to improve your view on grace in whatever way that it can.
Yeah, it's clear, I think, especially since the mid 80s when President Benson really urged all of us to go back and read the Book of Mormon. It started to become clear to us as Latter-day Saints that we believe in grace, right? The Book of Mormon is emphatic about the centrality of God's grace to our salvation. But it hasn't always been easy for us to find ways to talk about grace that aren't just borrowed from Protestantism, especially. And the problem with just borrowing Protestant ways of talking about grace, of course, is that way of talking about grace is rooted in the doctrine of original sin, with those assumptions about how suffering can be deserved, and in fact may always be deserved in one way or another. And so I think for us really as Latter-day Saints to own what the Book of Mormon itself teaches about grace, we have to work our way into a native Latter-day Saint way of talking about grace, right? A restoration, a kind of restoration grammar for how we talk about grace. And I've thought about my own book as just a kind of experimental addition to what I hope is our collective ongoing conversation about how best to talk about Jesus Christ and his offer of grace.
Yeah, awesome. So in chapter 2 of the book, the topic or the theme is grace. And you bring us...
And chapter 3 and 4 and 5.
Oh, wait, the whole book.
And...
But chapter 2 is specifically titled Grace, right? But yes, the whole book. In this chapter, you bring up the book Believing Christ, and probably maybe in other chapters. I'm sure in other chapters too.
Had you read this book? Were you familiar with this book?
I don't know if I've read the whole book. I know that I've read an article on the book, and I think that it's interesting that you say, as Latter-day Saints, we don't believe in the doctrine of original sin. And I agree with you that our doctrine is probably firm in that truth, right? Yeah. But I think that as I know for myself, I'm not going to speak for anyone else, but I know for myself, maybe there's been a lot of original sin belief in my life because that Protestantism or whatever, right, has filtrated in. And there are traditions of the fathers still in our beliefs, even though they're not necessarily the doctrines. And so it was really eye-opening for me to like really have this whole thing turned upside down. Like, and actually I want to say it turned right side up. I think Sister Nelson says all the time, the prophet, I used to say, you turned my life upside down. And he'd say, no, I turned it right side up.
I love it.
So I had similar experiences, just like you as a missionary, right? A mission was all about exact obedience. if you just had more faith, that's what they told me in Greece. If you just had more faith, the people here would get baptized.
Right.
And I would get really mad. And I would say, well, what about the faith to get out of bed every morning, knowing that no one here wants to hear anything that I have to say, but I'm here doing it anyways, because I believe it's what the Savior wants me to be doing in my life right now.
Yeah.
So in here you're saying, or he says, right, in his book, that the problem isn't that God is unwilling to offer the grace I need. The problem is that I am unwilling to receive the grace that God is giving. And then we get into these demands of religion and the to-do list that's, I don't know, 3,000 pages long of all the things that I could do to try to earn my way. And I think it's so interesting because it's not that we don't want to do those things, right? Like, I love going to the temple. It's an important part of my life. It's something that brings me great joy. And it can also become a taskmaster that sucks the joy out of my life if I use it as this standard to measure my worthiness, or to measure, maybe not even worthiness, but to measure my value or to measure my worth. I'm not valuable or worth anything if I'm not doing the to-do list that's forever long. So it's interesting, right? He argues that our logic is backwards, and you take it even further than he did, that yes, our logic has been backwards. My question is that sometimes as the world gets turned right side up, it can feel like it's getting turned upside down, and you sometimes don't know what to do with it all, because it almost makes what you have lived feel backwards or even wrong. And I remember in my own journey, like looking at my husband, who was the bishop, and saying, I don't know if I can stay in this religion. I don't even think it's the religion, but I think it's the culture of the religion that's been created that is this perfectionistic, I don't know, yuckiness. And I'm so grateful that I've made the choice to stay. But I remember just feeling like my whole world was upside down. I remember having conversations with people and them telling me that they thought I had been deceived, that I was doing it all wrong. And yet I was like having the most incredible experience that I'd ever had with God before. And it felt like my world was falling apart, and I didn't know what was truth. So do you have any words of wisdom for poor people like me who maybe as they step further into grace, as you look backwards, right, it kind of makes your life, you kind of start to question, like, wow, like, what have I been doing for the last however long? How do you let go of original sin and adopt original grace without it wreaking a lot of havoc, I guess, is my question.
Well, in some ways, a better version of that question might just be, how do I stop being a sinner, and how do I go about being saved? Because I think that's what's at stake, really, at the end of the day. It is, of course, one thing to practice a religion and even practice it seriously for a long time, and it can be surprisingly a whole nother thing to discover God, right, inside or outside your experience of that religion. I mean, for me, I'm a Latter-day Saint because I discovered God in the tradition, right? This is where he showed himself and is showing himself to me. So here I am, right? Whatever other questions I have left unanswered, this is where it's happening, right? This is where the promises that he's made are being fulfilled. The flip side, of course, of thinking that suffering can be deserved, the flip side of that, the inevitable flip side, is thinking that love has to be deserved, right? If I think that my suffering can be deserved, then I think that the point of my religion is to prove to God that I don't deserve to suffer, and that instead I deserve to be loved. But again, whenever we think about love that way, whenever we think about love as a kind of reward, that we earn in exchange for our obedience or faithfulness or whatever, then we've already evacuated the fundamental demand of the law, which is that love is a commandment. Love is not a reward that you do or don't earn under special circumstances. The commandment to love is not conditional depending on whether or not people have measured up to your expectations for them. The commandment to love is just that, a commandment, imperative, without exceptions, unconditional. You must love not only your friends, Jesus says, you must love your enemies. And Jesus, when Jesus explains this in the Sermon on the Mount, he's clear that God works the same way. God sends his rain on the just and the unjust, right? He causes his sun to rise on the good and the evil. God is everywhere and always only doing what is good. God's never in the business of doing evil, even in response to the evil that we do. But when we recognize, then I think, right, this I think is then at the heart of conversion, right? To undergo the kind of transformation that's at stake in being a Christian is to undergo a change in our perspective on the nature of love, in which we stop treating it as a reward that we have to either earn or dole out selectively, and we begin to treat it as a commandment, the way that God does. And when we begin then to unconditionally love as we're commanded, then we also become conduits for God's love, right? When we stop passively relating to love as a thing to be earned and instead as a thing to give, then we step into an entirely different way of living, and we step into an entirely different kind of relationship with God. And that relationship, I think the whole New Testament is trying to describe, is the essence of a Christian life.
So as you've been talking, I've been thinking about and this is why we need to put on Jesus so much, because my capacity to love at that level oftentimes feels undercharged, or as my child is screaming at me, right? Okay, in this moment she feels like my enemy, but the commandment to me is to love, right? No matter how she's acting, no matter what she's doing, no matter if it's my fault or not my fault, according to her, my invitation is to love her no matter how she shows up. And it's so interesting because I think that this is one of the ways that I try in my daily life to put on the Savior and to seek him to help me to have the ability to hold the love for her, right? In my natural state, it's really hard. I just want to snap back at her or tell her all the reasons why it's not my fault, or whatever it is, right? Or I want to help her see things differently. I still remember the day she taught me so much about, I think so often we're trying to fix things. And she wanted she calls it her snuggle bobby. It's her little blanket, and she really wanted it. She was really upset and I didn't have it. And I was like, I'm so sorry I don't have it. Will you just come sit with me and I will be your snuggle bobby? And she said, no, you can't, because it was so cute, because you don't have, or she said, snuggle bobbies don't have eyes, and they don't have ears, and they don't have a mouth, and they don't talk, Mom. Right? And I think that is something that the Savior is so good at, is just holding space for us wherever we are, whether we're in the depths of despair or in the thrills of joy or whatever our emotional state is. He is so good at just being with us. And I just, throughout this conversation, I would love to try to intertwine, how do we actually put him on? How, that's what you're talking about, is having this relationship in him and becoming a part of him. And so what does that look like in our everyday life? And I've gone rogue and I'm not following the questions in order, so who knows what'll happen with our discussion. But what do you do in your life to intertwine that relationship into your daily actions?
Yeah, that commandment to love, right, regardless, of whether someone presents themselves as friend or enemy. And a 6-year-old's not a bad example of somebody who can present themselves as an enemy, having been the father of 3 6-year-olds myself. That commandment to love, though, right, that applies not just to your daughter, but it applies to you. It applies to yourself, right? It applies to you in your failures to love your daughter, to love yourself nonetheless, where loving means to give what good is needed, right? Either the good that your daughter needs or the good that you, in your own weakness in attempting to love her, needs. Right? It's always tempting to slip back into thinking that, okay, good, now love is the universal commandment. Oh, and now I'm failing at that commandment too. Right?
Regularly.
Right, which is just another way, though, of saying, of course, that that I don't deserve to be loved, that I'm not applying the commandment unconditionally because I've accepted myself from the rule because I'm failing to love unconditionally. Though that, of course, is not how it's meant to work, right? I think on the ground, this is something that I really only get to at the very end of the book in some ways. When we try to turn the picture of love right side up, right? When we put grace first, when we treat it not as the backup plan, but as plan A, part of what happens too is that how we think about forgiveness turns itself upside down. But it's easy to think, it's easy to go to church for decades and think that the basic point of church is to engage in practices that will finally, maybe, fingers crossed, get God to forgive me for being who and what I am and for having done what I've done. Not that I don't need to be forgiven, but that's not, as best I can tell, the point of religion. That's not the point of showing up at church on Sunday. God is ready and willing, dying, literally dying, right?
Already died.
To forgive me, to forgive me for these things. But my being forgiven is contingent on my willingness to engage in the actual work of religion, which is forgiving. Now, Jesus is very clear about this in the New Testament. If you want to be forgiven, there's only one thing that you need to do: forgive. Right? You need to step into that work of forgiving, and then once you're part of it, you will yourself be forgiven. And as a very practical matter, I think this is what it looks like to participate in grace. This is what it looks like to practice love unconditionally. It looks like continually forgiving myself and my family and the world for being what it is and not what I needed it to be. And also continually forgiving me and my family and the world for then needing me to give it what it needs. Right? Both letting go of what my expectations were for what it ought to be like.
What I wanted it to be.
And then, what I wanted it to be. And then stepping wholeheartedly into the work of giving what is now needed, regardless of what I thought I wanted.
So beautifully stated. Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't get too far off track as I'm looking at chapter 3. Your title is
That's because all the chapters are just about grace.
We can just talk about grace and we'll be fine. We don't need to follow the script. So one of my favorite quotes that I've ever seen on grace is this. It says, "Expect to give yourself grace and be surprised by perfection rather than expecting perfection and then feeling obligated to extend grace." And I just think that is, as we step into grace and we see the world right side up, how God intended it to be, and we accept what is, we open ourselves to God's perfection.
One of my favorite philosophers is a 17th century philosopher named Spinoza. And Spinoza's definition of perfection is this. Spinoza says, "By perfection, I mean reality." And there's really something to that, I think, where the inherent perfection of things, shining from their own natures, not in light of my wants or expectations, is precisely what follows and what comes into focus when I'm willing to love them and forgive them, right? When I'm willing to see them for what they are, accept them for what they are, affirm them and care for them in what they need, and then the perfection of what they are shines through. But that shines through only in light of my willingness to buckle down and actually obey the commandment to love everyone and everything.
So I've wondered this a lot myself, because I think sometimes we think that there's this celestial realm out there that is somehow magically more perfect than where we currently exist. And by perfection in that sense, I mean, like, all of a sudden all the suffering goes away and everyone is healed. And I think I remember working with a coach, and she said, "What are you so afraid of?" Because I had so much fear in me. She's like, "What are you so afraid of?" And I remember being like, "I'm so afraid that I'm not going to make it." Like, I'm so afraid that there's not going to be a seat in the celestial place for me. But the more that I have experienced life and the more that I've learned, I can experience celestial days right here, right now in this existence pretty regularly if I choose in. And so we don't really know the answer. I don't know what your thoughts are on it. I don't know what the celestial world is actually like. But is there a way to open ourselves up to more of heaven here now?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. One of Joseph Smith's most radical ideas was that the celestial kingdom is this. It's here, right? This earth is and will be the celestial kingdom. This is the basic thrust of Jesus's own teaching of the gospel in the New Testament. Jesus's own teaching of the gospel in the New Testament has nothing to do with people escaping earth to finally safely arrive in heaven. He never says anything remotely about any of those subjects. Everything that Jesus has to say in the New Testament is about how the kingdom of God is arriving, right? You don't go there. It's coming here, right? And in fact, in some ways, Jesus says, "I'm here to announce that it's already here, and you can participate in it. You can participate in it or not. But regardless, it's here. It's now. It's me," he's saying. And the instructions that he lays out then, right, in terms of how to participate in that kingdom, the kind of thing that we get in the Sermon on the Mount, especially, that's the short list, right, of things to do in order to participate in that kingdom, in the kingdom of heaven, right here and now, in this world, in this life. That's what he's offering, right? Not salvation from this world, salvation in this world.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you. So I have the other day I reached out to a friend I was curious what other people would want to ask you when I had this opportunity to have this conversation, right? So I asked different people, like, what would you want to ask? So I asked a friend if she'd read the book, and she said, "I've started, but I haven't finished." And then she said, "And sometimes after reading his book, when I go back to the Book of Mormon, I don't feel like they are congruent with each other. So I'm struggling to understand how it aligns with the Book of Mormon." And I think that you address this even in chapter 4. You bring it up and you address it. And you talk about how the logic of original sin is interwoven, even in the scriptures. Maybe sometimes we even feel it or find it in general conference talks. I don't know what your perspective is on that. I think that what you're addressing is the process of revelation, and that God meets his people where they are and in an understanding that they can receive at that point in time. And you quote Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verse 24. Revelations are always given unto the Lord's servants in their weakness, after the manner of their language, that they might come to understanding. So, and then you remind us, hey, go back to Jesus. Like, what did Jesus say, right? Learn from Jesus. And I think we find that throughout the Book of Mormon as well. But what is your process for discerning truth? So many times in my journey, I just look to heaven and I'm like, can you help me understand what is true? I don't know how to deal with all these levels of understanding and everybody being at different places. And so how do I know what is truth? So your process for discerning truth, how do you divide the light from the dark? How do you step into spiritual autonomy and follow leadership, follow the prophet, follow the leaders in the church, even though does that make sense? Sometimes I have to remind myself, general conference is for the general people, and the prophet has told me to seek personal revelation. And so I can do both of those things.
Yeah, you have to do both of those things at the end of the day. No one can have a testimony for you. No one can have a relationship with God for you. Your value to the church, the substance of your participation in the church itself, will depend on the quality of your personal relationship with God. Those things are they're not separable. I suspect, your friend's story is not unusual. I've never been under any illusion that my work is for everyone or will be useful for everyone. I'm often surprised that it's useful for anyone. I'm often surprised by the kind of, to the degree that is given, right, the kind of positive response that my work is greeted with, in some ways as unusual as it is. If your friend ever has to choose between me and the Book of Mormon, she should choose the Book of Mormon, of course, every single time. That's what I would do if I were her. If I had to choose between me and the Book of Mormon, I would choose the Book of Mormon.
But I think what she's trying to say, and I would love your take on this, is,
Yeah.
and I think we see it in the Old Testament as well, right? It's how you're trying to change how we see justice. Because sometimes God looks like this very maybe angry God coming in and wiping out whole populations of people, right? I mean, with Noah, he wiped out the whole earth. And so we just have this idea about justice meaning punishment, maybe, right? And so sometimes it looks like in the Book of Mormon that justice is punishment. And so how do you, I don't know what the right word is, because I guess what God is doing in those moments, though, right, is giving what is needful.
Yeah.
Because what is needful for those people is for him to wipe them out and like bring them home and remind them a few things before they carry on with their progression.
Yeah, this is something that's become more and more obvious to me over the years as I've tried harder and harder to think about grace. That how we think about God's grace is going to be inseparable from how we think about the nature of justice. Right. And it's this question in particular that gets hard for us to think about, because we have a lot of baggage, right? We carry a lot of assumptions about the nature of justice that we've not only inherited from the broader Christian tradition, but that inform the very fundament of contemporary capitalism, right? Capitalism is all based around the idea that things have to be merited and earned and deserved. It's all about what you do or don't deserve in contemporary capitalism, right? It's the very logic of original sin at the heart of our economy. But when we I think step back to think more carefully about the nature of God's justice, the question is always what ultimately is at stake in his execution of justice. What's the purpose? What's justice aiming to accomplish? And I think pretty clearly on the Book of Mormon's own terms, the point of justice is to fulfill the demands of the law. And the question then is, what is it that the law demands? What is it that the law requires? And at the end of the day, I think it's irrefutable to claim that what the law requires is love, that what the law commands in every instance is love. Not only us, it's not just what God commands us to do, it's what God commands himself to do. It's the very imperative that God himself lives under, that commandment to love and to do what is good and to give what is needed, regardless of what people do or don't deserve. Now, the other related question then is, what does that look like? What shape does that take? If God disciplines me Does that mean that he's returning evil for the evil that I've done? In which case God is doing evil? That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, and it certainly doesn't seem to be a way of fulfilling the demands of the law, which are always to do what is good and to love. If discipline is needed, that is either, number one, an expression, I think, of God's love for me, the fact that that discipline comes from him, or it's just simply the natural consequence of my own stupid, foolish, evil actions. The very idea that God would have to punish me for evil seems to assume that my doing evil isn't evil in the first place, right? As if I could choose evil and it not get evil, right? And then God would then have to intervene to add some evil on top of the evil that I already gave myself in order to punish me for it. Evil is always its own punishment, right? That's built in, but I'm doing that to myself, right? And when God intervenes, right, it's always, I think, as a way of attempting to leverage what I've done to some good, despite whatever evil it brought about in the first place. And on the ground, that can look messy and complicated, but I think we can be confident that God never does evil, even in return for evil, that he's intent on fulfilling the demands of his own law, and that this is both the point of his actions, the point of his son's atonement, and the point of what he commands us to do.
So I think it's about keeping, like, understanding that the law, because I think sometimes, right, we think the law, I've been reading so much and I just keep reading those things about Christ came to, like, get rid of the law of Moses. But I think some of us still want the law of Moses. Just tell me all the things I need to do to get there, right? But yet we're being asked to raise to this higher law of love. Just discern what is needed and love people. And I loved your point of that does include ourselves. It does include, I have to give the grace to myself. And quite frankly, from my own journey, the more I've been able to receive it for myself, or the more that I've been able to accept it in my own world, it is so much easier to give to other people. Like, once I've been able to tap into that and forgive myself or love myself, or in the midst of that argument with my child, recognize that, hey, I need a moment to go gather myself so that I can be more present for her, right? And taking into consideration not only her needs, but my needs too, and what is needed for the greatest good of this situation. So it's remembering that the law is actually love. The law isn't about the to-do list, or the law isn't about even the 10 Commandments per se, because there's this higher law that trumps all the other laws, and that law is love.
Yeah, or at least none of those laws are ever about deciding what someone deserves, right? The 10 Commandments are never meant to be a measuring stick to decide, well, these people deserve my love because they kept them, and these people don't because they didn't, right? The 10 Commandments are commandments for how to go about loving everyone, regardless of whether they do or don't deserve it. And it's always a question of the purpose to which we're putting the law, whether that law is itself a means of fulfilling the commandment to love, that is the commandment to grace, or whether we use the law as a way of avoiding the very purpose of the law, right? It's easy to use the law itself as an excuse for not loving other people or ourselves, which is exactly the opposite of the point of the law.
Yeah, so beautiful. Okay, let's see. I don't know where we are. Let's talk about chapter 7 for a minute. The theme, or the I know it's grace, the overarching theme is grace, but the sub theme is the atonement, right? And you break down the two different logics to help us see that the logic of original sin leads us to pit justice and grace against each other in opposition. Like, one is on one side and one is on the other side. If we see through this lens of original sin, we think that the moral worth of an individual is judged on the basis of what they do or do not deserve to suffer, which is kind of what we've been talking about. But as we adopt the logic of original grace, we begin to see that justice actually is the work of relieving suffering. healing wounds and empowering people to actively do good. We begin to understand that natural consequences have no moral charge, that the moral worth of an individual is not based on what they do or do not suffer. From this view, we can see that justice and grace are actually on the same side of God's law. So, I think that what you're getting at is that we've been seeing sin wrong. Or I don't know if wrong is the right word, right? But maybe there's some different insights that we can bring into sin. And my question is, would you say that all sinful acts are simply symptoms of a deeper core issue? And if yes, then what would you sum up that core issue to be?
Yeah, all sinful acts are symptoms of the fact that we're sinners. That's the root.
Like your definition of sin, right, is that we don't accept God's love.
Yeah, and then right, what it means to be a sinner in general is to try to live in the world in a way that divides the whole thing up in terms of what people do or don't deserve, ourselves included, right? Which is a way of refusing the commandment to love everyone, which is what it means to be a sinner, right? To refuse the commandment to love. Because as Jesus himself teaches, right, that summarizes the whole law. The whole law is to love God and to love everybody else. And if I'm using the law to divide the world up into people that I do or don't have to love, then I'm using it to refuse the very essence of justice and the law itself. And that's what it means to be a sinner, right? To think about the world in this way, to think about other people this way, to think of it myself in this way, and then to get trapped in that logic. And it's easy then as a sinner, as we're trying to get out of that logic of sin, to understand sin itself on those same terms, right? We say, I got to stop being a sinner. I'm going to go to church and I'll do all these things. And then maybe God will love me and I'll stop being a sinner. But that is itself, of course, a sinful way of thinking about it. It's just itself a symptom of our sinful way of thinking about ourselves in the world, transplanted into the context of religion, with quite a bit of irony, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so fascinating when we see it this way, when we start to understand that sin is simply whatever sin it is, right? Whether it's a pornography thing, whatever it is, whatever the sin is that we've chosen, it's a lack of receiving love. Like we don't feel loved, and so then we take this action to try to fill the hole. Mm-hmm. Because we don't know how, like, I know that that's how I felt, like in my heart, like there just was this hole. And like, my limiting core belief was, I'm not enough. I will never be enough. And God has been teaching me so much about, it's not about you being enough.
Yeah.
I created you just like you are. You're not supposed to be enough on your own. Like that's,
yeah.
This is the plan. I made it this way so that you could partner with Christ and know that he's enough. And I still remember, like, there's been so many times, right, that just this little message has come in from some random email or just so many confirmations of it has nothing to do with what I can do. It has everything to do with what Christ has already done. And my job is to step into that and to let him be enough. Moment by moment, shortcoming by shortcoming, weakness by weakness.
Yeah, as sinners, we continually ask the wrong question and then don't understand God's answer when we get it. Right? As sinners, we continually think that everything is about being loved. That's a sinful way of living, right? Thinking that it's about me being loved or not. Right? To be a Christian is to let go of that question altogether. To be a Christian is to stop asking point blank, ever, whether or not I deserve to be loved or am loved. Right? To be a Christian is to throw myself wholeheartedly into the work instead of loving, right? Not passive tense, am I loved? Active tense, how do I participate in loving? And once we stop asking that first question and learn how to exclusively ask the second question, then our connection with God really sparks and really comes to life, and we find a whole new sort of life in Jesus that's filled with light and life that allows us to see the inherent perfection in both ourselves and other people, and that empowers us to give what's needed, regardless of what we do or don't think people deserve.
So beautiful. I know that in my own life, as I have just claimed that birthright, like that I am loved. That's given. That's just total, of course. Like God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Of course we're loved. And as I have allowed myself to receive that, it's done exactly what you said. It's empowered me and strengthened me and expanded my capacity to just allow that love to flow out of me to others.
Yeah. Yeah, we might say something like, love is never something that you have. It's only ever something that you do. If you do it, then you're a part of it. If you want to have it, you'll never will. It's not that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So this is interesting. Chapter 8, you talk about our nothingness and how that this plays
Everyone's
a
favorite
crucial
chapter.
role. And you have some really thought-provoking questions that you present, I believe, at the beginning of this chapter. And the question is, if grace is original, then why do I sin? And what motivates me to mistake myself for someone who doesn't exist? It's pretty deep.
It's like I'm a philosopher. Yeah.
Something like that. But what you're trying to do is help us, right? See the sinner differently. And you redefine a sinner as those who have abandoned God and are trying to save themselves, which I think it's the natural self in us, right? I think we can all relate to this experience. We're continually mistaking ourselves for someone who doesn't exist. With oscillating fervor, we mistake ourselves for a loser who deserves to suffer or a winner who deserves to be loved. We misread the world and misread everything in terms of what's deserved. So what would you say is your definition of God? If God is not a punisher, then who is God?
Maybe something like God is the one who, of all of us, is successfully, unconditionally committed to fulfilling his own law, no matter what it costs him. Whether it costs him his own life or his son's life or the whole of everything that he has, right? He's the one who's unconditionally and successfully unconditionally committed to always loving and giving, not only to his friends, but to his enemies. He's right. He's the one who sees, as I say in that chapter, that life cannot be won. It can only be loved. And he's the one who sees that trying to win it will always keep us from loving it. You have to choose one or the other.
Yeah, I love that line, that life cannot be won, it can only be loved. And if we can just put down the battle, put down the fight of trying to win something and just show up to be present for God's current perfection, right? Like, what if we could just see this world as already, I know it's really messy. I know it's hard to believe that messy is perfect, but I know in my own life, it's in those moments, it's in the really messy moments that God opens up really beautiful moments of his perfection and teaches me so much about who he is and how he loves.
Yeah, I think the only thing harder to believe than that all this messiness is in some way perfect. The only thing harder to believe than that would be that perfection excludes all this messiness. Because what would be left? What would be left of any of us? What would be left of who we are, of our relationships with other people, of the world to which we belong? Nothing would be left. Perfection would exclude all of us by definition. That's the only thing worse, I think. Though it is hard to believe the first. The second's even worse.
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up. That's a beautiful point. I think that for me in my own life, and I don't know how you do this in your own world, I'm actually in the midst of it, like right now in this moment. I talked to you about this before we started the recording, but I have this belief that God is always for me, always for me. Sometimes I hold to that belief more firmly than other times. But my whole life has kind of been this journey of learning how to trust his plans and knowing that those plans are way better than anything that I could plan myself. And there's been lots of times when I've had to let go of what I wanted in order to receive his perfection and his plan that is always better than mine. But right now, right, I'm in the midst of, my husband went to work this morning. We've got plans. We're supposed to be on an airplane in 2 weeks for the perfect family getaway, a month in Mexico, warm, sunny beaches, no family drama for Christmas. Like, it's not even possible because we won't be there, right? Like, I have this idea of what I wanted my perfect Christmas to be. And this morning, my husband went to work and his boss said, "You can't go." And we said, "Huh, what? You aren't, like, we asked you if we could go before we ever bought the tickets because we knew that it was a big ask." And we're kind of in the middle of a mess right now. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what the outcome is going to be. But I know that I'm so grateful for my core belief of God is always for me. And I know there's $2,000 that's not refundable. And I know that it's potentially not going to be what I hoped. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I don't know yet how God is going to work out the details. But I am grateful that I have this belief that God is for me. And I'm in this moment trying to stay open to all the possibilities, right? Because my husband said, "Well, maybe, I don't know how I feel about you taking our daughter by yourself." And my first reaction was, "No, I'm not doing that. That's stupid."
She's
right?
staying here
Like,
with
I'm
you.
not.
I'm going by myself.
Hey, maybe. But can I be open to, maybe she and I need to have an experience to go and bond and be together? Can I just be open to possibilities? And instead of shutting things down in the midst of this kind of messy middle, can I be open to God's grace? Can I be open to any and all possibilities and not saying, well, it's not the way I wanted it, so this is how it has to be? This is always my question. How do you keep your heart open and soft and malleable in the midst of, it feels like everything's falling apart? And mine, like, this is minuscule. It's a vacation, right? Like, it's a hope and it's a dream and it's good. But even more so, I have a dear friend who's in the middle of a really messy divorce, or I have a family who's in the middle of a cancer diagnosis that was very unexpected and really hard. And a few days later, the wife got in a car accident, and you kind of just want to throw your hands to heaven and say, "Come on, where are you?" And so in the midst of the messiness, what would be your advice to keeping your heart and your mind open to God's grace instead of shutting down and feeling like, man, I'm being punished, or maybe God doesn't love me, or like all those places that our minds go? How do we remain open and trusting that God is fully aware of the mess in the tiny details and working things out for our good?
It's, I think, a great description of just what faith itself is, to say that you trust that God is for you. That's what it means to believe in God, right? This is what it means to have faith in Jesus Christ. It's not a kind of abstract belief in the fact that somewhere out there in the universe a God exists, right? That has very little to do, I think, with actual faith in Jesus Christ. To have faith in Jesus Christ means that I believe, I trust that he is for me, right? And if I don't believe that he is for me, always, unconditionally, even if what I need is hard things from him, then I don't actually have faith in him, right? Regardless of whether or not I think a being exists out there somewhere in the universe or not. How to do that on the ground, right? Again, I think in a very practical way, from the moment I get up in the morning until the moment I go to bed at night, the work of being a Christian is to continually, hour by hour, minute by minute, second by second, forgive the world for being what it is, and forgive the world for needing from me then what it needs. Right? It's easy. It's not only easy, it's inevitable to feel like the world is our enemy. right? Because it is at the very least the enemy to our desires, our wishes, our expectations, because the world is not going to match up with my desires and wishes and expectations. And as long as I expect it to, it will feel like the world is my enemy. And I won't be able to see the good that the world is, because all I can see is the good that it isn't, that I wanted. Right? If I can let go of my expectations for the good that I wanted, then I can, on the one hand, see what good the world is, right? I can see the good that's inherent in every situation, no matter how messy and complicated. And I can see simultaneously with clear eyes, with even clearer eyes, what good is still needed in that situation, right? And I can feel the imperative to give it, to be involved in offering it. And both of those things, I think, are at the heart of what it looks like to try to live as a Christian, to continually forgive the world for what it is, and thus see what good it is, and to continually forgive it for needing what it needs from me, even though that might be hard to give.
Yeah, it can be so hard. Hence
It's
the
very,
messy
it's very
middle.
hard.
Hence the messy middle. Oh man. So in chapter 11, you talk about time, and I know we kind of skipped over, you talk about creation, and that creation is continually happening. And I think we touched on this a little bit earlier. I can't remember exactly where in our discussion, but I remember my coach used to say to me, creation is complete. Like creation is already complete. And technically, even before God organized the world, creation was complete, right? He just brought the elements together and organized something that already existed. It's not like he created something out of nothing. And so as we step into understanding that God is continually creating and recreating, you're trying to help us see that there's a reason God says you have a new start every single day, because creation starts again right now in this moment, and we are free to choose what we want to co-create with God. In chapter 11, you're talking about time, and time is such an interesting thing, right? I don't know how it works for God, but I'm reading a little bit from Neil Maxwell right now, and I'm like, whoa.
Yeah.
But so often in our mortal state, we're running from now. We're trying to get somewhere into the future, or we're trying to get somewhere in the past. And I don't know why our brains have such a hard time being in the now. And from everything I've started to understand, the only moment of eternity that we actually have is the present moment, is right here, right now. And so eternity is actually happening right now, right? But we're all like off like, oh, well, someday I'll get to the celestial kingdom. And I'm worried about this thing that's so far off that I'm missing out on God's perfection of the current moment. So do you have any tips or pointers? How do you recommend just coming back into the present moment and being with God's perfection that feels really messy, that muddy water? How do you love the muddy water?
Well, it's just another way, I think, of describing that same work of either forgiving things what they are and what they need, or of just fulfilling the commandment to love, right? Because as always, to love someone else is to be there, to be present with them, right? To see them as they are, to love them as they are, to give them what they need. You can't do any of that if you can't show up in the present. Though we are, as sinners, masters of distraction. And we are, as sinners, embedded in a technologically empowered world of sin, right? Empowered to be distracted in a way that we never have been before in the history of the planet. We face some big hurdles that I think we have to be very intentional about. Think about the nature and structure of our lives, of how we spend our time, of where we direct it, of what we give it to, in order to make sure that we don't We don't spend our lives in this profound state of distraction, regretting the past and worrying about the future, right? And instead being, as Jesus himself outlines for like 20 verses in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, we have to instead be like the lilies of the field who plant their roots and show up and just are what they are and can love what they see. Tomorrow will be evil enough for tomorrow. Jesus says, worry about what's going on right here and now today, like the lilies of the field. You can't add anything one way to the past or to the future, right? It's about showing up here and now, and that's the work, right? To love, to forgive, to be present, to let go of my expectations, to let go of my fears and worries and hand them over to God so that I can pay attention. And that's hard work. That's the substance of a religious life, but it's way, way better work than the kind of work that's impossible to do, which is saving myself.
Yeah, that scripture, it's so profound, and at the same time so beautiful. And I don't know at what point we humans decided that I've tried to put this into words so many times, like, what if our progression, what if, like, so many people in today's world are out chasing something, they're chasing their purpose, or they're trying to find themselves, and it's like, well, if you would just come home to the present moment, you'd find yourself because you're here.
It's the only
like,
place you could be.
Yeah, I don't know, it's so interesting, and that scripture is so profound, and I think it invites us into a whole new level of faith, really trusting that we are so much more important, so much more loved by God. I don't know if more loved. He probably loves the lilies just as much as he loves us, because they're so intricately and beautifully created, right?
Yeah, what takes more trust than the idea that right now is enough?
Yeah.
What would take more trust and faith from me than to trust God that right now is enough?
Yeah, and it's the monkey brain, right? I remember, this is always my example. My husband works nights. He works late, but then he also, like, oftentimes gets in things and has to stay later than normal or whatever. And when he's not home on time, my brain's first initial reaction, right, is to write the whole story about how he's dead on the side of the road and what am I going to do? And I'm going to be on my own. And, like, just our brains are just silly. But I've learned, right, to be like, okay, hold on. The last 999 times that this has happened, the truth is that he walks in the door late. So chances are he's going to walk in the door here in just a few minutes and life is going to carry on, right? And so I just think it's such an interesting thing to navigate. And I think that this is another way that we can clothe ourselves in Christ. He says in the scriptures, look unto me in every thought. In every thought. And I will never forget, actually, in February of this year, I went to Mexico all by myself. It was planned and it was beautiful. But I have never wanted to skydive in my whole life, but I feel like Christ literally invited me to skydive, because in your I know people are like, really? Like, Jesus?
I would
no,
I would
you have
turn that
no
invitation
idea.
down. Thank you there, Jesus.
Oh, I said yes. And I learned incredible things. I learned so many incredible things. I actually chose not to tell my husband that I was doing it, because I knew that it was a journey between me and my Savior, and that it had to be between just he and I. And I learned a lot of things. I learned that even if I died, I would still be able to communicate with the people that I loved. Like, I really learned that love knows no bounds. And I learned how to look fear in the face and come back to Jesus. And I learned how to know that even if I physically died, it would be okay. And I think that each one of us, I think you talked about this in the book somewhere, there is a death that we have to face. And oftentimes it's not the physical death, but it is a death of the ego or the natural self, whatever. There is something in us that has to die in order for us to be made alive in Christ.
That's a beautiful experience. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it was so profound and so beautiful. Even I got in the plane, and the guy who did all my photography and stuff, his name was Christian. All the little synchronicities that lined up. But what would you say, what is that piece that has to be let go of and released and has to die in order for us to truly put on our Savior and partner with him to be made alive?
You got to jump out of the plane.
Heck yeah! Why don't you go skydiving?
You got to trust the parachute. I mean, another way to say this, of course, which I would hope is just another version of the same thing, is to say that we have to stop trying to be in charge of our own lives, right? We have to let God be God. We have to let God be in charge of our lives. We have to put ourselves into his hands, right? In life and death and good or bad, richer or for poorer, right? Whatever comes, we have to put our faith in him, that he is for us, and that there is good in it, and there is good for us to give, even if it's not the good that we wanted to give, and even if the good that we're given is not the good that we wanted, right? But that's the work. Turn your life over. Stop living my life and live his, right? Take his name, give up mine. That's the work all day, every day.
Yeah, in the skydiving world, they say, take the toggles, Jesus.
Take the toggles, Jesus. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, take the toggles, Jesus.
Jesus, take the wheel.
That's right, right?
Yeah.
It's that word, I think it's that word, surrender.
Yeah, we don't like it. We're sinners.
No. Well, and for whatever reason, I don't know why we don't trust that this loving being would give us what is good and what is needed. And I think for me, I have to recognize that, like, my soul's deepest desires are different than maybe my temporary impatient I want this right now desire, right?
Yeah.
And when I can remember that I have a soul that utters, it's Romans 8:26 maybe, that the soul utters prayers that we don't even know how to express ourselves. We don't know how to pray ourselves. Those are not the words in Romans, but something along those lines.
Yeah, groanings that cannot be uttered.
Yes, right? And so can I trust that my deepest desires and my divine soul is working to co-create with God in the midst of this super messy middle?
Yeah, I think that's right. And our deepest desire is love, but not to be loved. That's wrong. Our deepest desire is to love, and that's the work.
That's beautiful. I know for me in my own life, there was like this middle step though that I had to learn how to receive the love. I had to learn how to be loved in order to then step into a greater experience of being able to give love.
Yeah.
Because if I don't, for a long time, I didn't feel loved, if I'm honest.
Well, you have to love
right?
yourself, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the scripture even said so, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. It's assumed. I still remember one of my biggest mom wins. I went on this whole journey and had a coach who challenged me to 30 days of love notes to myself. And the first time she said it, I'm sure my eyes bugged out of my head. And I was like, sounds impossible. God showed me all the time that anything is possible. But
yeah.
I took her to heart and I started writing love notes, and I probably wrote a love letter to myself for almost a full year. But what I loved is that because of who I was being in the world, my little person wanted to be like me, right? Isn't that what our kids want, is to be like their parents? And so I still have somewhere, I don't know where it is, but I still have somewhere for very first, I think she was 5. her very first love note to herself. And in the beginning, it even just said ILM, because that was all that she knew how to write, but she knew that it meant I love me. And I think that there's a dance to be done between loving ourselves and learning how to receive. And for me, loving myself is really just about learning how to receive God's divine love that is always accessible and available, always given. It's me just stepping into and receiving that. And then as I receive that and I'm filled with that, it just pours out of me.
Yeah, even there, right? The work of writing yourself love notes. That's you doing the work of love. Right? I mean, you're receiving it too, but really the magic I think happens in that you're doing it. You're loving. And that's the real that participation, I think, is really the crux of it ultimately.
Absolutely. Well, this has just been a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me today. Do you have the book handy? I would love for you to read just the very end. Maybe you know it. I don't know if you know it word for word, but if I remember right, at some point you got to listen to, what is the man's name? Robinson. What's his first
Stephen
name?
Robinson,
that wrote. Yeah. And you gave a speech at something that he was at or that was honoring him. But then later you got to hear from him again. And at the very end of your book, you share his analogy of grace. And I would love for you to read that for us if you've got it.
Yeah, it's over here.
Okay. I give you permission to go grab it.
You want the last full paragraph, really? What would you like? Starting where?
I think what did you say? How does it start?
Where would you like? What paragraph? How does it begin?
So I don't have it in I just have everything you'll ever need to know about grace can be learned in the following way.
Okay. I'll just give you that whole last paragraph here.
Perfect.
Stephen Robinson concluded by confessing that he didn't especially love theology. Where theology always wanted definitions, he much preferred analogies. Everything you'll ever need to know about grace, he said, can be learned in the following way. Hold the baby in your arms, perhaps while the family is out, perhaps in a chair, perhaps your own son or daughter. What do you feel? An absolute love. What has the baby done to deserve your love? Nothing. What would you sacrifice for that baby? Everything. This is God. This, Robinson said, is grace.
Doesn't that sum it up? If we could all see ourselves and everyone else in the world, right, as those sweet babies that we absolutely love them with our whole everything, and yet they've done nothing to deserve it.
Yeah, that's God.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I can't wait to share your thoughts with the world. So thanks for joining me today.
I'm grateful for the invitation. Good work.